So today, Sentinels have obviously announced the signings of Pancada and Sacy, two of the Brazilian players from Loud. And I wanted to sort of talk about the move and go into more detail as to what happened. Talk about the final player on the roster and basically what Sentinels' plans were and what they're going to be. So we'll just start off at the beginning of October. Obviously, Sentinels at this point was in a very sort of disjointed state. You had a few players that had contracts that were expiring at the end of the year, obviously Tens being one of them, and then Shazam being another one. Both of those players had contracts that were going to expire at the end of this year, meaning they were free agents, technically. They were able to sort of go and look for new opportunities. And Sentinels wanted to overhaul pretty much the entire roster because Sentinels have not had a good 2022. And they've sort of been on the downwards trajectory since 2020 pretty much, and then late 2021 obviously is when it got really bad. So this is what's happening with Sentinels. Obviously they have they signed two coaches. They signed Psycho, obviously formerly of Exet, who's a very successful coach at Exet. You've got to remember that the Exet team was one of the few North American teams that obviously got to champions earlier this year. And then you have Ghost Gaming coach Adam Kaplan. Now Kaplan is he's probably one of the most underrated coaches, I'd say, in North America. He's joining as the strategic coach. Obviously, this has already been announced, and this was reported 3rd of October. I reported this. So basically, what Sentinels did was they got these two guys in. They got Psycho and they got Kaplan, and they basically said, look, we need you guys to rebuild this roster from scratch. What's going to be happening, and basically we'll basically give these guys free reign. And then after they got these guys, Def basically came with them. Now Def is one of the players that has not been announced yet. However, he will be the final player. I believe obviously it mentions here. So the Sentinels roster is going to be Def, Sacy, Pancada, Tens, and Zekken, obviously. Both Zekken and Def, formerly of Exet. But to sort of keep the timeline as, sort of strict as possible, what had happened was Sentinels signed Psycho and Kaplan. They obviously brought on Def as well. And then it was just a matter of whether they can get Zekken as well to go along with Def and Psycho, obviously, so that they could build the core around those guys. And that was basically what happened. Obviously, this meant that Raucus was going to be out of the team. There was a time where I believe Raucus was in the discussion to stay, but that never really ended up happening. So obviously Raucus now off the team, and Sentinels have Psycho and Kaplan to sort of lead the coaching staff. Now, since that happened, obviously you had quite a lot of speculation going on during this period. I know a lot of people believed that Marv, for example, was going to be joining Sentinels, and there was discussions with Marv. I know that I could sort of tell you guys now that yes, there was discussions between Marv and Sentinels, but they didn't really go anywhere. It was one of those things where, these deals just sometimes don't pan out, and this is what happens. So there were early discussions. They weren't prominent discussions. I don't believe there was like contract or anything like that. There was nothing like that. They were just early preliminary discussions, and from that they sort of pivoted towards having the Brazilians on the roster. Now, this came later in October, obviously, when I reported it, that basically Sentinels were going to be signing Sacy, Pancada, obviously two Brazilian players, to play in Sentinels alongside Def and then Zekken as well. And then Tens would be at the time, Tens was a question mark because we didn't know if he was going to sort of stay and sign a new contract. But as I mentioned here, according to the sources that told me, it was pretty likely that Tens was going to stay. There were a lot of question marks surrounding Shazam as well. Obviously, Shazam found out, he says, that he was not a part of the team through my article. I'm not sure how true that is, but again, I don't know about the internals specifically, so I can't really comment on that. So yeah, obviously Sacy, sorry, should I say? I always pronounce his name wrong. I'm sorry. Sacy, Pancada, both integral players to the success of Loud, obviously during their Champions run. I think there was, some of the best performers. Obviously, Loud were the most recent victors at Champions. They managed to defeat Optic twice. Obviously, Optic known as probably the best team in the world at this point. alongside the likes of FPX. And we, Loud was kind of one of those teams where we didn't really think they were going to win, but they came out and won it anyway, and they barely lost a map, so they played incredibly well. They even beat DRX, Leviathan, Zeta. They absolutely crushed it. And obviously Sassy and Pancada were two of the core players, I guess, in that roster. Pancada being the smokes player, and obviously Sassy on things like Sova and other agents like that. So yeah, they were very successful. They were very, very successful, and they done very well. Obviously Pancada was probably the standout player I know, alongside the likes of Sadak being the IGL and Aspas, for example. But yeah, they played incredibly well. Now I think one of the biggest questions for this roster would be the communication barrier. I think that's one of those things where we don't know how the two cultures will sort of clash. But I think that if there's a sort of rigorous system installed, and it's not one of those where, I think Sentinels wants to be known as a team that are dominant and they want to win everything, rather than be known as this kind of stream team, this kind of, only focuses on streaming rather than, actually practicing. And I'll tell you this right now, Pancada, Sassy, Def, you are not getting away with not practicing. Like, this is something that you will have to be doing. Tens will have to be practicing. Zekum will have to be practicing. And I'm not saying those two didn't practice before. I'm saying that they will. These guys here will install very, very good morals in these guys, and I think that they are incredibly, incredibly useful to this team. Now, obviously, moving on, today it was the announcement of Sassy and Pancada, and Sentinels are now yet to announce, I believe, Def. Def is the final person. Excuse me. Def is the final person who they did not announce, and I believe that will be coming shortly. Obviously, today it is the roster lock, the soft roster lock, should I say. And what that means is teams will need to field a minimum of 6 players to Riot. They will need to have contracts done until the end of next year. And yeah, so they will need to field 6 rosters, a coach at the minimum. 6 players, sorry, and a coach at the minimum. They will submit that to Riot, and then they will obviously get that done for next year. They will need to have contracts that expire by the end of 2023. And obviously that is when the conclusion of the season will happen for next year. So, yes, obviously, to recap for those that aren't really that tuned in terms of what's happening next year, the regions are sort of being split up and put together, if that makes sense. There's going to be an Americas International League, there's going to be an EMEA International League, and an Asia International League. Now, the Brazilian players here, obviously, will be playing in the Americas International League. That will be confined to the Brazilian region, Latin America region, and the American, or obviously North American region. So you will have the likes of Loud playing up against, even Sentinels, NRG, Cloud9, etc. And I saw a lot of people ask why Sassy and Pancada aren't considered imports. And it's just mainly because Sassy and Pancada are both from the same region as the Americas, as Sentinels, basically, because they compete in the Americas International League. So, for example, if they were to bring 2 players from EMEA into Sentinels, that wouldn't work because you're only allowed 1 import slot. So, yeah, that's what's happening with Sentinels. Obviously, Tens is the main one. He's going to be staying. This means that a few players are going to be out. Obviously, most notably Dapper and Shazam. Both of those players will be off the team. Shroud is obviously not on the team. Zom's not on the team. So they have quite a few players that will be on the bench. Obviously, Sick is still, I believe, under contract. So realistically, you do have quite a few players that will be exiting the roster. And we'll see what happens. Obviously, Sinatra as well. Still important to mention. So, I think we'll definitely be seeing what happens with Sentinels. I think they'll be a very interesting team to watch. In terms of some of the other, in terms of the other rosters, I think that Sentinels has probably some of the best firepower, I would say. It's just whether they gel as a team, because I know sort of culture clashes could be a thing, and I think that'll probably be the biggest worry. But other than that, I think it's fine. I think Kaplan and Psycho are incredible coaches. I also think that Def is an incredible in-game leader. So I think if there were 3 people that would be sort of the figureheads for the roster and moving the team forward, I think those guys would be probably the best players you could have picked up. So overall, I think very smart business for Sentinels. I think they've done very well.